Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hope you're all safe, sound, and healthy. And once again, when these things come around, the reason why I try to resist talking about them is number one, everybody's already talking about them. They've made the news, they've made international headlines. Everybody's already spectated over it, speculated over it. But I usually just limit myself to giving my opinion or my personal instinctive reaction or instinctive calculation towards whatever it is that has happened to either myself or a few people around me who are interested to listen to what I have to say, which, let's face it, is not many. But okay, because like right now, the PIMS fire incident, which in my mind, I always will think of it as the PIMS arson incident. And I was the probably first person to say it out loud. And finally, obviously, witnesses have come forward. Parents of the dead kids have come forward. It's very painful. It's tragic. But if you look throughout history, you would know that what I'm saying, it makes absolute sense. Throughout history, governments have staged false flag operations against their own people in order to maintain control, in order to maybe take over control, in order to topple a government, in order to strengthen their own governance. The first thing that I said was whenever the army acquires something or whenever the army fails to acquire something, why is it that there's always an incident that occurs, a tragic incident in which human lives are treated as collateral damage? And now people are coming forward, as I said, witnesses who were there. For example, locked doors. Why would you always have locked doors in a hospital? Although, to be very honest, when it comes to emergency exits, I have noticed that in Pakistan and even in England, to be honest, in England too, I've noticed this many times. The emergency exit is always locked or it is always open. And when it's open, it means it's kind of useless because it means that it is not triggered by any alarm or, because normally what happens is that there is a sort of a wire. I mean, if you do it properly, then there is a sort of a wire that triggers the doors, But then there are also those places where they just have their emergency exits that are just simple doors where they're very heavy to open, but they are usually unlocked so that anytime there's an emergency, you can just rush out there. Then the bigger the hospital is, the more the emergency exits, right? But obviously, again, as I said, there's a lot of carelessness when it comes to emergency exits in Pakistan and in many countries, not just Pakistan, most countries. I've even seen that in so-called developed countries. There is this, there is a point, up to a point where they start becoming reckless and careless in their emergency exits. Now, PIMS is supposed to be a government hospital, albeit in 2023, as we know, the government tried to give its charge over to the army, but the Pakistan Medical Association pushed back, and so that whole thing was revoked. It was withdrawn. But as we know, the army is already infiltrated everywhere. So, right now, for example, the director or even the executive director of PIMS, they are basically, answerable to the army. They are answering to the army. They have been making false medical reports for political prisoners, as per the army's commands and demands, and as per the government's commands and demands. And as we know, the army is basically the government at the end of the day. So if we're saying that the army is in charge of it, then, or the government is in charge of it, it's more or less the same thing, right? So as I said, one of the other things that came to light was the fact that the room, the facility in which the babies were kept, that was locked. Again, why? Parents are supposed to be able to go in and out of that room. Staff is supposed to be able to go in and out of that room. A third thing, the staff wasn't even there. No doctors, no nurses, no staff, as in not even the cleaning crew, nobody. And also, in another floor, they had noted, some of the witnesses who were in another floor, they noticed that the staff that were present there, they were silently, hurriedly moving out. without telling the people there that, okay, you know what, this is an emergency, let's all evacuate. No. In fact, if anything, when only one of the nurses apparently raised the alarm that, there's a fire and everybody needs to leave. And when they tried to leave, instead they were stopped. When the parents over there, or the visitors over there, or those whose babies were there, the family members, when they tried to leave, they were stopped. They were actively stopped from leaving by the staff, that no, you cannot leave. Again, why? So everything points to my very first reaction that I had. My very first response to this fire was arson. Because let me tell you one thing, even in a place like Pakistan, things don't easily catch fire. You may try to blame the equipment, you may try to blame electricity, you may try to blame power surges, you may try to blame anything you like to, but touch wood, mashallah, I know one thing: despite everything, despite all the shortcuts, despite the jugars, despite the seemingly unprofessional unprofessionalism when it comes to wiring and everything, I'll tell you one thing. Yeah, things, buildings, shops do not catch fire easily. Remember the Hafiz Center incident? Yeah, the way the whole Hafiz Center caught fire, and so many shops just burnt out just like that. And even then, many of the shopkeepers, they were not averse to the idea that this was a deliberate act of arson. Right? Whenever an important building, especially, or a government-owned building, especially, whenever that cedes to fire, understand that somebody has deliberately committed arson. It means there's something that they needed to hide. To be honest, unlike other people who are speculating that, maybe it had to do with the complaints with regards to how, as we know, there have been smuggling of babies, as in stealing of babies and then announcing to the parents that they're dead, but they were actually stealing and smuggling those babies, illegal adoption, whatever you like to call it, that there was this whole thing going on. And even now the parents are basically screaming blue murder, that they did not even see a piece, not even a piece of not even a bone, not even a flesh, not even a clothing, nothing, not even a hair, nothing of their babies who were supposed to have been allegedly burnt to death alive in that fire, which is so tragic that babies were burnt. I mean, seriously. And then, when, as I said, when my first response was that this was arson and this was deliberate, and it was a deliberate act by the army and the government, and then people were like, do you think that they can be so cruel? And I'm like, that's the whole problem. Throughout history, governments have never ever looked at the mass, the public, as lives that matter. To them, they are collateral damage, not even collateral damage. In fact, sometimes they are the means. They want tragedy, they want lives, they want bloodshed in order to achieve what it is that they want to achieve. They're means to their ends, So it is tragic, but it is a fact. But now here's, as I said, where I differ, where many people were saying that it's maybe to hide the corruption and the baby smuggling and this and that the obviously government bodies are involved in, because it's always the government, as I've said before. If you look at the American government and establishment, and people in the behind the government, the deeper state. If you look at them, be it Europe, be it America, be it the royal families of Europe, including the UK, be it all of these people. They have been heavily involved in cannibalism. They've been involved in child trafficking and pornography. They've been involved in child slaughtering and taking of children's blood, because to them children are pure. And so if you drink their blood or if you transfuse their blood, then you can gain immortality and all. And people were thinking that these are all fantastical conspiracy theories going around. But obviously now, as time goes by, people are realizing that no, these dark satanic occultist people, these psychopaths, these demented sociopaths, these insane people, they really do exist, and they really are doing all the stuff. They are actually into cannibalism and all the satanic acts, and they are into trafficking of children and trafficking, smuggling of babies and illegal adoption, and they are into sex trafficking, they are into drug trafficking, they are, I mean, that, how else do you think they sustain themselves, right? Especially when you think about intelligence agencies like CIA and MI5, MI6, where they have to work on vast areas, they have to work across continents. They need funding. And as we know, for the longest time, the British and the Americans, they relied on drugs. It was, first of all, they embroiled China into the whole opium war thing. Then they, took over Afghanistan basically because they wanted all their opium. And so when the Taliban started setting fire to the fields in opium because it's against Islam, then they had a problem, and so Taliban became the biggest snakes in the grass for them and everything. So it's always about what suits their because this is their bread and butter. This is how they run their system. This is how they sustain whatever it is that they do. So, but still, as I said, despite all of that, I go very, I may, and I know what I'm going to say may sound like, the people would think, no, we'd rather go with the child trafficking thing. That makes more sense. It sounds more plausible, because why would anybody set fire to a hospital because of Imran Khan? Because that was my point. My point was, they now want to be able to have an excuse not to send Imran Khan to any hospital for any treatment whatsoever, because in the beginning they at least had the excuse of taking him to PIMS, and now they're probably thinking that, okay, if we reach a sort of a negotiation through the court or through the parties, that okay, fine, you don't want to take him to the hospital, to his hospital, or to Shifa International Hospital. You don't want him to be treated by his own doctors and everything, but okay, at least then let him, the eye treatment that he was having in PIMS, let that continue. And I feel that for them, they decided that, let's just set fire to the whole hospital, killing two birds with one stone. This is what they do. This is what the governments do. It's killing two birds with one stone. So on one side, they will finish off the whole Imran Khan going to PIMS thing, so that he wouldn't even be able to go there for his treatment anymore. And they will also be hiding their documentation where they are stealing and selling babies. So you know what I'm saying. So corruption plus corruption, two different types of corruption. To hide both these corruptions, just eradicate the whole building, and through that a third bird. So the army will officially take over. So that is my opinion. Okay. Now let us see as to why it is so plausible that the government and the army are behind it, and why to them human lives do not matter. Because I'll give you just a few major historical examples where state actors or intelligence agencies used operations affecting their own public or territory to achieve strategic goals. Okay, you have the 1931 Mukden incident, where the Imperial Japanese Army blew a small section of a Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria, China, and they blamed the Chinese dissidents for the explosion. You see, this pattern, especially of the army, has been repetitive throughout history in almost every country, and it's in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in America. It's a constant. This is something that is evergreen. In Pakistan alone, as we know, like for example in Banu, the army was now literally shooed away by the people of Banu. The Banu police police has a sort of a peace committee that they formed, and the members of the Banu police peace committee said that not a single army now will be tolerated, not a single army officer, soldier or personnel or cadet will be tolerated in Banu, because these people are actually the ones who bring in the terrorists. They create their false flag operations, they bring in terrorists, they cause distress amongst our people in our otherwise very peaceful region, and they facilitate those terrorists. They are behind the terrorists. They in fact are the terrorists, and so they incite terrorism. And then when their goals are achieved, then they and the terrorist, they both disappear, or actually the terrorists suddenly disappear and they are sitting there achieving their goals. Because as we know, the northern areas of Pakistan are actually the most peaceful areas in Pakistan. But notice how they always come in the news, especially in American and European news outlets. When they want to build that narrative, they always seem to attack especially the bordering areas of the northern areas, right? Because that is where their interests lie. They want those areas to not be peaceful, so that the army should always be present there, so that it could facilitate the American and the British and the NATO troops to go there when they want to wage war in Asia, especially against China and Russia and all, right? So this is an ongoing thing. So what was the goal of the Japanese, you might ask? The Japan used this fake attack as an excuse to invade and conquer the entire region of Manchuria. You see, it's exactly the same goal, as I said, which they are trying in America, in Pakistan, which they're trying in Indian occupied Kashmir, which Pakistan has now intruded upon Azad Kashmir, and they're doing the same thing. All, for the Gora Bandars, their white masters. Now, then you have the Gliwice incident. I think I might be pronouncing it wrong because this is a German word. But the Gliwice or the Gleiwitz incident, which was in 1939, this was when Nazi Germany's SS and military intelligence operatives dressed concentration camp prisoners in Polish military uniforms, shot them, and left their bodies at a German radio station near the Polish border in order to make it look like a Polish raid. And the goal was that Adolf Hitler, he used this stage event the next morning to claim Germany was defending itself, launching the invasion of Poland and starting World War II. Again, as we can see, this is very repetitive. You can relate to this. It's going on in almost every country now where the army or the government suddenly come, like 9/11. 9/11 is again the best recent example of a false flag operation where the Pentagon itself was a part of it. The President Bush himself, gave orders, and they created this whole charade so that they could attack and invade and use different Muslim countries of their choices to achieve strategic goals of invasion, of looting and plundering, and of maintaining control, and specifically of maintaining their bases in those particular countries for, again, future war options. Now, Operation Northwoods, this was 1962 proposed. So the United States Department of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff were the ones behind it. And what they did was they drafted a secret plan to stage fake terrorist attacks, shoot down a drone disguised as a civilian airliner, and orchestrate violent acts in the US cities. Remember, as I said, the 9/11, in many of my previous podcasts, I'd mentioned this, that the 9/11 was not their first, So this was, again, as you can see, the same pattern. And what was their goal? The plan aimed to blame the Cuban government to create public support for a US military invasion of Cuba. And President John F. Kennedy completely rejected the proposal, and it was never carried out. But obviously, as we know, Bush reenacted the whole thing for 9/11. Again, 9/11 was a two birds, one stone thing. On the one side, because they've always wanted to demolish the World Trade Center, but they were never getting the green signal for it. So they needed that done, and at the same time, they needed their political goals to be achieved. And especially, I keep on reminding people, your whole Surveillance Act, which in the name of Patriot Act, that he needed that to pass, because they needed to have complete police state control. And so for that, they needed surveillance, and not just in the United States, but obviously because the goal was imperialism and recolonization. So obviously they needed all the allies and the other parties, the other countries, to also add their own surveillance units, their own CCTVs and everything. And then at the end of the day, it will all come back to the American data centers, so that they could have complete control over again, in any future war or in any invasion or in any conquest, then they would know exactly how to move and how to use people's private data to twist it to suit them, which again, as we know, they heavily experimented on and they carried it out in the 9/11 operations, the post 9/11, as you know, when they started arresting people illegally and they turned America and half the world into their own personal police state. Now, we have Operation Gladio. This was the 1960s to the 1980s. And who was involved in it? Who was behind it? We have NATO and European intelligence agencies, particularly in Italy. And what were they doing there, basically? What was the whole point, or what was the whole stage? The secret stay-behind networks engaged in a strategy of tension, basically. So what they did was they orchestrated horrific bomb attacks on trains and public squares. Then they deliberately planted evidence to blame left-wing communist groups. Again, as we know, America did it again in Europe. Again, they did it in Germany. They did it in France, I think, and they did it in Italy even, as you know, when they were trying to force them to be pro-Israel when they were pro-Palestine. As we know, this is just like literally a few years ago. It was the time when I think I had published my the part 2 of the Mist series. Yeah, I think I had mentioned it in that book, or was it just after that? Now, the attacks, what was the goal behind the whole thing? The attacks were designed to terrify the public into voting for conservative anti-communist political parties and to justify increased state police powers. Again, you see there, this is the running theme here, okay? Then you had the 1999 Russian apartment bombings. Allegations point towards the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. A wave of explosions hit apartment buildings in Russian cities, killing over 300 people. As you know, the more the bloodshed, you know, the better the narrative that you can sell. The government blamed Chechen separatists immediately. And what was the goal behind it? The bombings justified launching the Second Chechen War, which vaulted then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin into immense popularity and power. So while official Russian investigations blamed terrorists, several investigative journalists and formal intelligence defectors accused the FSB of planting the bombs themselves. So this is just, you know, these are just some of the most major cases. Again, if you dig deeper and dive deeper, you would go into how the British, when they had colonized the subcontinent, how they also did their own, and what they did with China, and then what they did, the ethnic cleansing in America and in America and Latin America and in Canada, done by the British, the Spanish and the French. So which the Spanish people try to very neatly forget it, but I think they really cannot forget what they did in what is now Latin America. So yes, this is why, I instinctively, when you know that and you see the pattern, it becomes too clear, and you cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot then, you cannot be brainwashed easily. And as I said, for people like me who are writers and whose whole, I have written more than 40 books, okay? I've written more than 40 novels. But as I said, I need mental peace in order to even digitize my old manuscripts. And it was with great difficulty that I digitized one of them and managed to publish that. And as you can see, that was my latest published novel, which is called A Novel. And it was actually written in 1999. And it was about Kashmir and the occupied Kashmir and Pakistan's Kashmir, and about how a Kashmiri girl survives through it all. And, although it had nothing to do, the Kashmir was more like the background or the backdrop or that was all her identity and what made her be what she became later on. But it was not more about her just being a Kashmiri as it was about how she moved through life and how she made her life and her career and all the experiences that she went through and everything. So, and the point is that when we We writers, we create worlds, and our job is to create believable words, not just as novelists, but also screenwriters, or I should say, not just as screenwriters, but as novelists, because I'm both. Among screenwriters, you would think that, yeah, because it's audiovisual, they have to build these worlds. But why do you think so many novels have been adapted into audiovisual format? Why? They have been adapted into films and into dramas and into series and serials. Why? Because they, in written words, and just on pages, they have built believable worlds, right? So that's why when we even write books, when we write novels, when we write stories, and even if it's fiction, we make it believable. So we kind of tend to see good or bad story writing. And I can tell you one thing: politicians, especially all these governments, people in the establishment and the intelligence agencies, they're all, at the end of the day, actors. Okay, they're actors, and they're performers, and they have a stage and they have to perform. Okay, they're like, just think of them as monkeys as well. They're monkeys performing, and whoever performs the best gets upgraded. But the problem is they now do not care so much for setting up scenarios, that their narratives are getting flimsier and flimsier, and they're getting shoddier and shoddier in their work. And the words and the stories that they're building, the narratives that they're building, they're getting sloppier and sloppier, because they don't care. Because, as I said, it's now time for them to, as far as they're concerned, they've reached the final phase where now they don't really need to put on that mask, of pretense. So it's masks off, basically. That's why they're not bothered. Okay, it's not about old dogs, new tricks. No, it's about they're not bothered anymore, because as far as they're concerned, it doesn't matter now if the masks are off. That's all. And this is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.